My name is Claire Bennett. I am 38 years old, and last Christmas, I sat down at my parents' dining room table, thinking the evening would be like so many others. The tree glowed, the turkey smelled perfect, and for a brief moment I let myself believe peace was possible. Then, between the clinking of glasses and the passing of dishes, my younger sister Monica smiled at me and announced that she would be moving into my house. The room fell quiet, every eye waiting to see what I would do. Have you ever been caught in a moment where silence would cost you everything but speaking up might change your family forever? That night I had no choice but to answer. Let me take you back to where it began. The scent of roasted turkey lingered as the silence stretched across the table. I felt my heart pounding, even though my voice had come out steady. Years of swallowing words, of letting Monica's declarations go unchallenged, had taught me the art of keeping a calm face when my insides churned. Tonight, though, there was no going back. I watched her blink once, then twice her smile, trying to return but failing. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his shoulders rising and falling. He cleared his throat, forcing out a laugh that sounded brittle. "That is not funny, Claire. You should not make jokes like that in front of everyone." He turned his eyes toward the others, silently begging them to join his side, but no one moved. Elaine leaned forward, her pearl necklace catching the light from the chandelier. "What do you mean the keys belong to someone else?" she asked it with a trembling voice, though beneath it I caught the edge of accusation. She had probably been looking forward to this moment all day, the unveiling of Monica's new living arrangement, the latest proof that their favored daughter would always be taken care of. I folded my napkin and rested my hands on it, keeping them still so no one could see the tremor in my fingers. "I meant exactly what I said," I replied evenly. "The house is sold." The words fell like a heavy stone into deep water. Monica's jaw dropped slightly. Her painted nails tapped against the stem of her glass. She let out a sharp laugh, brittle and high. "You cannot be serious. You sold your house. You knew I was moving in." I took a slow sip of water before answering, letting the coolness anchor me. "Nobody asked me if I agreed," I said quietly. "Everyone assumed." The turkey sat untouched in the middle of the table, steam rising as if mocking the sudden chill in the room. My father set down his glass and pressed his palms flat on the tablecloth. "Claire, this is absurd. There are always cooling-off periods. You can cancel something like this if you come to your senses." I met his gaze, the same gaze that once made me shrink as a teenager desperate for approval. "Not this time. It is done." Elaine shook her head, her voice softening as if she were addressing a patient instead of her grown daughter. "Honey, I am worried about you. Selling your home like that right before Christmas without talking to us first. It seems reckless. Are you under some kind of stress? Have you thought about seeing someone to help you with decisions like this?" My chest burned at her words. I had heard that tone before, the careful implication that if I did not comply, then maybe I was unstable. It was the family's way of keeping me in line, the subtle suggestion that independence equaled dysfunction. I straightened my back. "I am fine, Mom. What I am not is a doormat." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Monica's eyes darted to our parents, then back to me, searching for the safety net she had always relied on. I thought of the 9 years I had spent building my life, the overtime hours, the vacations skipped, the sacrifices made just to afford that house. I thought of the roof repairs, the leaks, the furnace that had finally given out. Every dollar I had scraped together had gone into keeping that place standing, and still they had looked at it as nothing more than an extra room for Monica. I pushed my plate back gently. "I came here tonight to celebrate Christmas with my family, not to be ambushed with plans made without me." Monica's voice cracked louder now, the mask slipping. "You are doing this just to hurt me. You knew I needed a place. You waited until tonight to humiliate me." I met her stare, steady and unflinching. "No, Monica, I am protecting myself." The words tasted sharp, but they were true. I had never said them out loud before. The candles flickered as if stirred by the tension. Around the table, no one reached for the turkey or the mashed potatoes. The meal sat cooling, forgotten. I felt the air heavy with disbelief, anger, confusion. Yet beneath it all, I felt something else, something I had not felt in years at this table: control. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "We will talk about this later. Tonight is not the time." But the time had already come and gone. I looked around the table at the stunned faces at Monica, still frozen in her seat of honor at my parents, who could not quite mask their fury. I rose slowly, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. "I need some air." I walked toward the living room, past the tree glittering with ornaments from our childhood. A paper angel I had made in second grade hung crooked near the bottom, bent and faded. Above it, a gleaming glass ornament engraved with Monica's name caught the light perfectly. It felt like the story of our lives told in decorations. I paused by the window, looking out at the quiet street, lined with snow. Families in other houses laughed and clinked glasses, their joy muffled through walls and frosted panes. Behind me, the murmur of voices began again, low and urgent, but I did not turn back. For the first time, I let them talk without me, my breath fogging the cold glass, as I stood alone, steady, knowing the balance in this family had just shifted in a way none of them expected. Richard's chair scraped back from the table, the sound sharp against the hardwood. His voice cut through the low murmurs, louder than the ticking clock in the hallway. "What on earth do you mean the house is sold?" He leaned forward, palms flat on the table, his face redder than the wine in his glass. Elaine's hand hovered over her fork, her eyes darting from him to me. She looked as though someone had just pulled the rug out from under her. Monica, still sitting at the head of the table, stared wide-eyed, her champagne flute slipping from her fingers. It tipped and shattered on the floor, golden bubbles spreading across the rug, ignored by everyone. I turned back from the window and walked slowly toward the table, my heels quiet on the floor. My heart pounded, but my steps felt steady. I pulled my chair back and sat down again, folding my hands in my lap. "I have 30 days left," I said calmly. "After that, the house belongs to someone else." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Richard's mouth opened and closed once, like he could not quite find the words. Then his voice rose again, harsh, like a verdict. "This is not final. You can cancel a sale. There is always a cooling-off period. No judge would hold you to something rash done without counsel." My jaw tightened. I had expected this. I had rehearsed it in my head, knowing how he would lean on his authority, how he would try to intimidate me into bending. "It is done, Dad," I answered, my tone clipped. "The papers are signed." Elaine finally found her voice. She leaned across the table, her pearls swaying with the motion. "Claire, sweetheart, listen to me. Selling your home without even telling us first, right before Christmas. That is not like you. Something must be wrong." Her voice was soft, soothing, the same tone she used when neighbors lost jobs or church members faced illness. To everyone else, it sounded compassionate. To me, it was a blade. "You make it sound like I am unstable," I replied, keeping my voice level though my pulse hammered. "I am not. I made a decision." Monica blinked fast, her eyes glistening. "So you are really going through with this? You knew I needed a place. You knew, and you did it anyway." Her voice cracked and she pressed a hand to her chest, as if the betrayal might physically break her. "No one asked me if I was willing," I said. "The decision was made around me, not with me." Richard slammed his hand against the table, rattling the silverware. "We are your family. Family talks, family works things out. You cannot just decide something like this alone." My lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "I already did." The turkey cooled, untouched, the cranberry sauce darkened at the edges, but no one cared. The meal that was supposed to hold us together had turned into the backdrop for a battle none of us could avoid. Elaine pressed her napkin to her lips, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Claire, I am asking you as your mother. Tell me the truth. Are you under stress at work? Is something happening we should know about? Sometimes people act rashly when they are overwhelmed." The implication landed hard, and I felt the sting in my chest. I recognized it immediately. If they could not control me with guilt, they would question my sanity. It had worked in the past. Not anymore. I straightened, resting my palms flat on the tablecloth. "I am fine. I am not overwhelmed, and I am not acting rashly. I chose this." Monica's breath came in quick bursts. She turned toward our parents, her voice trembling with practiced pain. She is punishing me. She knew I needed somewhere to go. She sold the house just to spite me. Richard pointed a finger at me. Tell her she is wrong. Tell her that is not why. I looked from one to the other, their faces lined with disbelief, with anger, with fear of losing control. I will not defend myself against lies, I said simply. Elaine exhaled, her shoulders slumping for the first time. Her gaze swept around the table, landing on the other relatives searching for support. Aunt Carol shifted in her seat but said nothing. Even she looked uncertain now. The grandfather clock chimed 8, the sound deep and resonant. It marked the moment for me, a reminder that time kept moving forward no matter how much they wanted to freeze me in place. I placed my napkin beside my untouched plate and stood. My voice was steady, though I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. I am not discussing this any further tonight. Elaine's face pinched, her tone suddenly dripping with sweetness, every word meant to cut. Claire, you have always been so strong, but strong people break too. Maybe you just do not realize it yet. I met her gaze, unflinching. I realize exactly what I am doing. Richard muttered something under his breath, his hands tightening around the stem of his glass until his knuckles turned white. Monica dabbed her eyes, letting her tears fall freely, hoping to draw all attention back to her. I stepped away from the table, the room thick with the scent of cooling food and unspoken rage. In the silence that followed, I could hear the faint laughter of children outside, sledding down the snowy hill across the street. Their joy carried through the glass, so different from the heaviness inside. I knew this was only the beginning. I walked into the hallway and leaned against the wall, the garland scratching against my sleeve, and the sound of my parents whispering in the dining room faded into a blur. My chest felt heavy, but my mind was clear, sharper than it had been in years. Moments like these never came out of nowhere. They were planted long ago, watered and nurtured by years of imbalance, until they grew into nights like this one. I thought back to when I was 12, the age Monica was given her first expensive dollhouse shipped in from Germany, with real miniature chandeliers that actually lit up. I had asked for a new pair of sneakers for basketball. Richard laughed and told me his strong girl did not need new shoes every season, that I could manage just fine with last year's. Monica got the dollhouse, and I learned to run drills with blisters on my feet. The pattern never broke. At 16, I started babysitting every weekend, not because I wanted extra spending money, but because if I wanted to go to the movies or buy a yearbook, I had to pay for it myself. Monica, at 16, had already racked up her first credit card bill. Richard called her tender-hearted, said she was not built for stress, and paid it off with a smile. I learned to walk home in the snow after late babysitting shifts, saving every dollar. She learned that someone would always rescue her. By the time I was in college at Northwestern, I was working 2 jobs. I cleaned dorm bathrooms at 6 in the morning before class and answered phones at a campus office until 9 at night. Monica had dropped out of community college, by then overwhelmed by the workload of 3 classes. Elaine told everyone at church that her youngest was finding herself, that school was not for everyone. When Monica's car got repossessed, my parents quietly co-signed another loan, never once mentioning it to me. I still remember the call where Mom bragged about how responsible they were being, giving Monica another chance. I survived on peanut butter sandwiches and instant noodles. There was no call offering help with my tuition or rent. I sent home money from my campus job to cover my phone bill, and my parents deposited funds into Monica's account to help her buy clothes for job interviews she never showed up to. The memories pressed harder the longer I stood in that hallway. I could still picture the first time I asked for real help. I was 29, 2 years into owning my little house in Evanston. A storm had torn shingles from the roof, and rainwater had soaked through to the attic. I asked Richard if he could loan me some money to cover the repairs until my next work bonus. He sat at the kitchen table, coffees steaming in front of him, and told me I was resourceful, that strong people figure things out. That same week, Monica called crying because she had fallen behind on her rent again. They wrote her a check without hesitation. I remembered the sound of Elaine's voice when she told me about it. She was almost proud, saying it was only right to help Monica through a rough patch. I never told her that I had taken out a high-interest loan to patch the roof, the payments dragging me down for years after. The word rough patch seemed to stretch across decades. Monica's rough patch became a lifestyle. My resilience became a weapon they used to excuse neglect. Every holiday was a reminder. At Christmas, they gave Monica gifts wrapped in glossy paper gadgets and jewelry she had hinted at. I got a check written hastily that barely covered what I had already spent traveling home. The sharpest memory came back like a knife. Just last year, Monica had fallen behind again, 3 months late on rent in her Chicago apartment. She called Elaine sobbing. Richard said they would not let their baby girl lose her place. They wired the landlord the full amount. That same month, my furnace failed. The estimate for replacement was $6,000. I called Elaine, desperate, explaining the situation. She sighed, said money was tight, that perhaps I should consider a space heater until spring. I swallowed hard in that moment and never asked again. I signed on for another line of credit, the interest climbing like ivy around my neck. That was the moment I knew things would never change. Now, standing in my parents' house with laughter muffled from outside, I let the truth settle fully. My strength had never been seen as something to admire. It was an excuse. A justification for them to give everything to Monica while expecting me to carry myself. They praised her fragility as if it were a virtue, while mine was treated like armor they could pile more weight onto. I remembered the look on Monica's face the third time they bailed her out of rent. Relief mixed with entitlement, like it was her due. I remembered the way Richard told me proudly that they had stepped in again, as though it proved their generosity. When I asked quietly if they might help me with the roof, he waved me off. He said life was tough, and tough people find ways to manage. I closed my eyes in the hallway and saw the buckets I had lined up under the leaks, the water dripping steadily, while I sat on the floor, calculator in hand, trying to stretch numbers that refused to stretch. I could still hear the steady patter against the bucket lids, the sound of my own exhaustion echoing with it. The anger rose hot and steady, but beneath it was something else. Clarity. That was the moment the decision to sell my house had really begun. Not last week or last month, but the day my parents told me my struggle was not worth their help, while Monica's mistakes were worth endless rescue. I opened my eyes and straightened the garland, scratching again against my sleeve. From the dining room, I heard Elaine's low voice, still performing concern, still trying to cast me as the unstable one. Monica sniffled loudly, playing the part she always played. Richard muttered about responsibility, about family obligations. I looked back toward the window. Snowflakes fell heavier now, catching in the glow of the streetlights, each one silent and cold, but together forming a blanket. Families across the street shouted and laughed, sleds scraping against the icy hill, their joy sharp against the muted drama in this house. For a moment I let myself breathe with them, as if I could inhale their ease. Then I exhaled steady and long, remembering buckets, catching water in a dark attic, remembering unpaid bills, remembering that third rent payment my parents made for Monica while I patched shingles alone. That memory was not just a wound, it was a scar, a permanent reminder of the roles we had all been forced into. And standing in that hallway, I finally understood that scars can guide you, not just hurt you. 3 days after Christmas, I found myself sitting at my dining room table in Evanston, a stack of folders spread neatly in front of me. The holiday decorations still hung on the porch, but inside my house the lights were dim boxes, half-packed the air, carrying that hollow feeling of endings. I had spent the last 9 years building this place, and now I was preparing to walk away. Yet as I pulled each envelope from the pile, a calmness settled over me. Proof mattered. I had learned that the hard way. Richard and Elaine arrived first, bundled in their coats, their faces pinched against the cold but their eyes sharp with intent. Monica trailed behind them, her phone in hand, eyes darting around the room as if she were taking inventory. I invited them to sit. No food, no holiday cheer this time, only the thick silence of a confrontation none of us wanted to delay. I slid the first envelope across the table. The roofing invoice, $12,000, dated 2 years ago. I remembered the contractor's voice telling me the shingles should have lasted another decade. I watched my father's eyes move across the paper, his jaw tightening. Next came the plumbing bill, $9,000 the summer. The water line cracked under the front yard. The mud had seeped into the basement, ruining boxes of books I had saved from college. Elaine's fingers trembled slightly as she scanned the figure, her lips pressed tight. Finally, I placed the furnace replacement, $6,000 last winter's nightmare, when the house had gone cold for 3 days in January. I remembered sleeping in my coat, breathing steam in the dark, waiting for the technician to arrive. Monica glanced at the number and rolled her eyes. I leaned back in my chair, letting them sit with it. "These are not stories," I said quietly. "These are facts. This house drained everything I had. I worked every weekend shift Harper & Company could give me, skipped vacations, canceled dinners, ate cheap meals for months on end. That house was never a free space for anyone." Richard cleared his throat, his voice lower than usual. "Houses are expensive, yes, but everyone manages somehow. You did not need to go to such extremes." I lifted my gaze to meet his. "I managed because I had no choice." Elaine placed the paper down gently, as if it might burn her. "Sweetheart, you should have asked for help." The bitterness rose before I could stop it. "I did ask. I asked when the roof leaked, and you told me strong people figure things out. I asked again about the furnace, and you told me to get a space heater. But you found the money when Monica needed rent covered. 3 times. Silence hit the room harder than shouting ever could. My father's hands folded, then unfolded, restless. My mother's eyes darted toward Monica, who seized the opening. She leaned forward, her tone dripping with outrage. "So this is about jealousy. You could have told me you were drowning, Claire. Instead, you sell the house just to punish me." My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed even. "This is not about you. It is about me surviving." Monica's laugh was sharp, forced. "You sound heartless. Who does this to their own sister at Christmas?" I placed my palms flat on the table, steady grounding myself. "Who expects to be moved into someone else's house without asking?" First, her cheeks flushed red, her eyes darting to our parents. She knew she had no answer. Richard finally spoke again, softer this time, like a man trying to salvage control. "You always were independent, Claire. Maybe too independent for your own good." I nodded slowly. "That independence is why I still have a career, why I could pay these bills when no one else stepped in. But it is also why I cannot keep carrying this alone." Elaine reached for my hand across the table, her voice honeyed, her eyes imploring. "We only wanted to help Monica through a rough time. You know she has had her struggles." I let her fingers touch mine but did not close my hand. Rough times that last over a decade are not rough times. They are choices. The words hung heavy, and even Richard could not bring himself to argue. Monica pushed back from her chair, the legs scraping against the floor. She stood, hands on her hips, eyes wet, but her voice rising in practiced drama. "You are cruel. You always look down on me. Now you have proved it to everyone." I did not rise. I only gathered the papers back into their folders, stacking them neatly, my movements calm in contrast to her storm. "Cruelty is expecting someone else to clean up your life forever." Her mouth opened, then shut, no words forming. She turned to our parents, waiting for them to rush to her side. Richard and Elaine remained seated, their faces pale, their silence louder than any defense. I placed the folders back into my bag, slid the zipper closed, and leaned back. This conversation is finished. The room was thick with tension, but underneath it I felt a strange lightness. I had laid the truth bare, paper by paper, number by number. For the first time, they had no ground to stand on, no story they could spin, to erase the reality in front of them. I stood and walked toward the door, pulling my coat from the hook. Behind me, I heard Monica's chair scrape again, her voice sharp, accusing echoing in the hollow space of my home. But this time, her words felt powerless. Outside, the snow crunched beneath my boots. The air bit at my cheeks, clean and cold, sharper than the air I had just left behind. I pulled my scarf tighter and started down the street, my breath rising in clouds. Somewhere behind me, the lights of my house still glowed, but in a few weeks they would belong to someone else. For the first time, that thought did not sting. It steadied me. The following morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened my phone, still wrapped in my robe, trying to shake off the heavy conversations of the last few days. What greeted me on my screen made the mug tremble in my hand. Monica's face stared back at me from a Facebook post, her eyes wide and tearful in the selfie she had taken. The caption beneath read that her own sister had made her homeless at Christmas, that she had nowhere to go, and that she was devastated to learn family could treat her this way. The comments stacked underneath in long threads. "You're so strong, honey. We're praying for you." People offering her spare rooms, couches, sympathy. Then I saw Elaine's name. "We're here for you, sweetheart. Always." My chest tightened as I read those words, the betrayal deeper than the cold outside. I set my coffee down before I dropped it, my hand shaking against the counter. In a few short lines, Monica had rewritten the story, casting herself as the victim, me as the villain. The truth of bills and repairs, of years of work and sacrifice, meant nothing against the power of a single post and a curated photograph. By noon, the post had been shared by 3 relatives. My phone buzzed with notifications from cousins I had not spoken to in years. One message from my aunt in Ohio read, "I can't believe you would do this to your sister. At Christmas of all times." The words blurred on the screen, my breath coming fast. I shoved the phone into my bag and drove to work, the familiar streets of Evanston sliding by without registering. My office at Harper & Company Media sat quiet when I walked in, but eyes lifted as I passed. Conversations hushed. By the time I reached my desk, Lisa Harper from Accounting was standing there, her expression pinched with concern. "Claire," she whispered as if discussing a scandal, "I saw your sister's post. Is it true you sold your house and left her with nothing?" She glanced around as if she did not want anyone else to hear. "If you need help, my church has a program for people without housing. We can find her somewhere to stay." The heat rose to my cheeks, shame mixed with anger, though I had done nothing wrong. Lisa looked at me with pity, not understanding that the story she had read was a performance, not reality. I pressed my palms flat on my desk. "Monica is not homeless, Lisa. She has an apartment. And parents with a 4-bedroom house. She is not sleeping on the street." Lisa's eyes widened, but her doubt lingered. She gave me a small nod and retreated, but I knew the conversation would not end with her. By afternoon, 3 more coworkers had stopped by, each asking in roundabout ways if I had really left my sister stranded. The whispers followed me down the hallway, clinging like smoke. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by boxes, my phone buzzing again and again. Finally, I opened the group chat our extended family used for birthdays and reunions. My stomach dropped. Message after message painted me as cold, unfeeling, heartless. My cousin Jennifer had written, "How could anyone do this to family?" Uncle Robert added, "A house is not worth more than your sister." The words burned. I scrolled until I found Elaine's reply, chiming in with careful sorrow. "We are very worried about Claire. She is not herself these days." I knew what she was doing, weaving the same narrative she had tried at the table, that I must be unstable, that my decision to sell was proof of poor judgment. I dropped the phone on the table, pressing my hands against my face. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down hard, the years of being cast as strong, now recast as cruel. Monica had always played the part of fragile, and fragility was easy for people to rally around. No one wanted to rally around the sister who had always been self-sufficient. I opened my laptop, the glow harsh in the dark kitchen. I pulled up the invoices again. The roofing bill, the plumbing disaster, the furnace replacement. They sat there like silent witnesses. I had kept them for my own records, but now I understood their other purpose. Proof. Receipts that could not be spun into lies or twisted into melodrama. The house creaked in the winter cold, the heating system humming, the same system I had replaced when my parents told me to buy a space heater. I wrapped my sweater tighter and sat in the dim light, scrolling through Monica's post once more. Every new comment landed like a stone, each one stacking higher, building a wall of public opinion against me. I thought of the times I had carried Monica home when she was too drunk to drive, the nights I had edited her resume, the mornings I had lent her money knowing I would never see it again. None of that mattered now. The only thing people saw was a crying selfie and a carefully worded caption. The quiet of the house pressed in around me, but in that quiet I felt the same steadiness I had found in the hallway on Christmas night. Let her play her campaign on social media. Let them whisper at work and shake their heads in the family chat. Paper does not lie, numbers do not lie, and soon enough I would show them. By Monday morning the buzz had already reached the office. I stepped into Harper & Company, media's glass lobby, the hum of conversation sharper than usual. A pair of co-workers from design glanced at me and then quickly looked away, their whispers following me to the elevator. By the time I reached the 12th floor, I could feel the weight of stairs pressing in like smoke clinging to my clothes. At my desk, Lisa Harper hovered nearby. She smoothed her blouse, eyes darting nervously before she leaned down. "Claire, I know things are hard right now. My church has a housing ministry. They help people when they don't have a place to stay. We could get Monica on the list." She meant well, but the pity in her tone landed like a slap. I forced a small smile, keeping my voice even. "Lisa, my sister, is not homeless. She has an apartment, and she still has my parents' house if she needs it." Her brows furrowed, lips parting as if she wanted to argue, but she just gave a tight nod and walked away. I watched her go, my chest aching. It did not matter how calmly I explained. The story had already taken on a life of its own. By lunch, the whispers had grown louder. Passing by the break room, I caught fragments. "Left her sister with nothing. Can you believe that?" The words burned, but I kept my head high, my heels clicking on the tile. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. In the afternoon, my manager Daniel stopped by. He was a tall man, in his 50s kind, when he wanted to be, but always careful about appearances. "Claire, could you step into my office for a moment?" His voice was polite, but I heard the steel underneath. I followed him in the blinds, half drawn, the Chicago skyline muted behind gray clouds. He gestured for me to sit. He rested his elbows on the desk, fingers laced. "I wanted to talk with you about something sensitive. Personal matters can sometimes bleed into professional life. And here at Harper & Company, our reputation is built on trust." I felt my stomach tighten. He was too practiced, too careful. I knew where this was going. He cleared his throat. "I've heard some concerns. People are talking. Stories circulate quickly, especially online. I just want to remind you that personal reputation affects how clients see us." For a moment I could not find words. My tongue felt heavy. My sister's lies had not only poisoned my family, but now they threatened the career I had fought tooth and nail to build. I steadied my breath. "I understand, Daniel, but I want you to know the stories aren't accurate." He gave me a sympathetic look that did not reach his eyes. "I'm not judging, Claire. I just need you to be aware. That was all." He dismissed me with a nod. Walking back to my desk, the office felt colder, the walls closer. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly. As I typed meaningless emails, the words blurring. Years of discipline, of pulling myself up, of never asking for help. And here I was, being quietly warned because my sister had posted a picture with teary eyes and a dramatic caption. By 5 o'clock I was exhausted, though I had done nothing all day except defend myself in silence. I packed my bag and started toward the elevator. That was when Thomas appeared, leaning against the wall with his coat slung over one arm. He was younger than me, early 40s, sharp, but easygoing, the kind of colleague who noticed more than he said. "Rough day?" he asked, falling into step beside me. I gave a humorless laugh. "Something like that." We rode down in silence until the doors opened into the chilly lobby. Snow swirled against the glass doors, flakes sticking to the sidewalks outside. Thomas glanced at me. I saw the post. "You don't owe me an explanation, but I know how these things go. Families twist stories. People believe what's easy." His words stopped me. I searched his face, expecting judgment, but found only steadiness. I exhaled, shoulders loosening. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded. "If you need help moving when the time comes, I've got a truck and a strong back. Just say the word." The lump in my throat surprised me. In a week where everyone else seemed to see me as cold or cruel, here was one voice offering help without strings, without pity. I blinked hard and managed to smile. "I might take you up on that." "Good," he said simply. Then he opened the door, and let the winter air rush in, holding it for me as we stepped out into the cold. The city streets glistened under the snow headlights cutting through the dusk. For the first time in days, the whispers and the lies felt a little smaller, a little less sharp. Someone believed me even if it was just one person. And that belief, quiet and solid, was enough to keep me moving forward. Saturday afternoon, I pulled into my parents' driveway, the snow piled high along the edges where Richard had shoveled earlier. The windows glowed warmly against the gray sky, but my chest tightened as I noticed extra cars lined up at the curb. I recognized Aunt Carol's station wagon, Jennifer's compact, and the dark sedan that belonged to Uncle William. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of coffee and cinnamon filled the air, but the tension was thick enough to cut. Elaine greeted me with a quick hug that was more performance than affection. "We are all waiting in the dining room," she said, her tone clipped. I followed her down the hallway and into the room that had once been the backdrop for birthdays and Thanksgivings. The long table was cleared, except for a neat stack of papers already placed in front of my seat. They wanted me to defend myself here on their stage. Monica sat at the far end, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her lips trembling as though she had been crying for hours. Richard stood at her shoulder, hand resting protectively on the back of her chair. I slipped into my seat and unzipped my bag. From it, I pulled the folders I had spent nights organizing, each labeled, each filled with invoices and bank statements. The room fell quiet as I laid them out in front of me, the soft shuffle of paper the only sound. Richard cleared his throat, his voice carrying the authority he always assumed would silence me. "Claire, this family needs to come to an understanding. Selling your house was rash. We called everyone together today so we can figure out a solution before it's too late." I kept my eyes on the papers, my fingers smoothing the edge of the roofing invoice. $12,000, I said, sliding it across the table. 2 summers ago, when the storm ripped half the shingles away, the contractor told me they should have lasted 10 more years. Insurance denied the claim. I paid every cent. Aunt Carol frowned, leaning closer to see the number. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Uncle William adjusted his glasses and studied the invoice without expression. Next, I placed the plumbing bill on top. $9,000. The water line burst in July. The city dug up my front yard and told me the pipe on my side was my problem. Mud filled the basement. I spent weeks drying what I could save. Elaine pursed her lips, her eyes flitting between me and the paper. Richard looked away. Finally, I set the furnace replacement in the center, $6,000 last January when the house froze. I slept in my coat for 3 nights. I paid a technician up front because no one else was going to cover it. The numbers sat heavy in the silence. My chest rose and fell evenly, though my heart pounded. These are not whims. These are choices I had to make to survive. Selling the house was not rash. It was inevitable. Uncle William leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "As a lawyer, I can tell you, once a contract is signed in Illinois, there is no cooling-off period for real estate. This sale is binding unless the buyer fails to perform." He glanced at Richard. "Your daughter's decision is final whether you approve or not." Richard bristled, his voice rising. "Families find ways around things. We can talk to the buyers, appeal to their decency." William shook his head. "You cannot undo this without consequences." Monica slammed her tissue onto the table, her voice breaking. "So, you are telling me Claire destroyed my future on purpose? She knew I needed her house. She knew, and she sold it to strangers just to ruin me." Tears streamed down her cheeks, glistening under the chandelier light. Elaine moved to comfort her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "See what you have done, Claire. She has nowhere to go." I looked straight at Monica, my tone steady. "You had an apartment. You had options. But you and our parents decided my home was the solution without ever asking me." Her voice grew shrill, filling the room. "Because you are selfish. You always thought you were better than me. Now you get to play the victim, showing everyone your papers and your numbers, while I lose everything." I gathered the invoices back into a neat stack. "I am not playing anything. I am showing reality." The room was still. Aunt Carol stared at her folded hands. Jennifer tapped her nails nervously against her mug. Uncle William adjusted his glasses again, his gaze steady on Monica. You cannot expect your sister to carry you forever. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed louder, shaking her shoulders for effect. Elaine rubbed her back, glaring at me over Monica's head. Richard muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if I had broken some sacred rule. I zipped the folder shut, my pulse slowing. For years I had been painted as the strong one, the one who never needed help. Now they wanted to twist that strength into cruelty. But the papers spoke louder than their stories. I pushed my chair back and stood, the wood scraping softly against the floor. The coffee on the sideboard had gone cold. The plates stacked neatly beside it were untouched. The whole gathering had been a performance, and I had refused to play my part. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, coating the driveway and muffling the sounds of the neighborhood. For a moment, no one moved. Monica's sobs filled the air, but I let them wash over me without bending. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair, my voice calm. I have nothing else to add. Before I could step toward the door, a voice rose from the far end of the table. It was Dorothy Lane, my mother's oldest friend, the woman who had known us since we were children. She had been quiet until now, sipping her coffee, her face unreadable. But when she set her cup down, the sound was firm enough to pull every eye toward her. I have sat at this table too many times to count, she said, her voice steady but carrying weight. And I have watched Monica receive help with rent, with car payments, with credit cards for years. Her words hung in the air, cutting through Monica's sobs like glass. I remember Elaine asking me to co-sign once back when Monica was behind again. I said no, and I still stand by that. Elaine stiffened, her hand frozen on Monica's shoulder. Dorothy, that is not fair. It is fair, Dorothy, replied, her tone sharper now. Claire bought this house on her own. She worked double shifts to keep it. I remember her walking into the clinic on Sunday mornings, exhausted but still showing up. No one bailed her out. And yet when Monica fell behind, the money was always found. Richard's face darkened, but he did not speak. Monica looked up, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice rising in desperation. You make it sound like I am lazy. I have just had a hard time. Dorothy's gaze softened but did not waver. Everyone has hard times. But hard times do not last 15 years. The room fell quiet again, the weight of her words pressing against the walls. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across Jennifer's face, her eyes dropping to the tablecloth. Aunt Carol shifted in her chair, no longer leaning toward Monica, her mouth pressed in a thin line. Then Barbara Mills, my financial advisor, cleared her throat. She had come at my request not as family but as a witness to reality. She adjusted her blazer and spoke with professional calm. When you provide constant financial rescue, you remove any reason for change. It creates dependency. The giver is drained, the receiver never learns resilience. In my work, I see it all the time. Families who think they are helping end up crippling both sides. Elaine's lips parted in protest, but Barbara raised a hand slightly, her voice measured but firm. Claire did the right thing by making a decision for her financial health. Selling a home before it sinks you further is not cruel. It is responsible. Richard exhaled loudly, his hand drumming against the wood. Families help each other, he muttered. That is what we do. Barbara looked straight at him. Helping is teaching someone to stand. Enabling is carrying them until you collapse. Which one do you think you have been doing? The question cut the air clean. Richard's mouth opened, then shut. Elaine's eyes flashed with anger, her voice suddenly sharp, louder than it had been all night. We are talking about family. We do not abandon each other because of numbers on a page. Claire has forgotten what it means to belong. I felt the sting, but Dorothy's voice came again, gentler this time. Belonging does not mean sacrificing your life for someone who refuses to take responsibility. I have watched Claire carry her load alone. If she has finally drawn a line, it is long overdue. Monica slammed her palm on the table, the tears returning in waves. So now everyone is against me. You are all just letting her win. Uncle William shifted, clearing his throat. No one is against you, Monica. But the contract is binding. The sale will go through whether you approve or not. The sound of Monica's sobbing filled the room once more, but it was different now. Not triumphant, not convincing. It sounded hollow. I scanned the faces around the table and saw doubt creeping and sympathy draining from eyes that had once looked at her with unwavering indulgence. Elaine's hand tightened on Monica's shoulder, her glare fixed on me. Her voice was cold, stripped of sweetness. "You may think you are justified, Claire, but one day you will regret turning your back on your own blood." I slipped my arms into my coat sleeves, the fabric heavy but warm against me. "Maybe," I said quietly. "Or maybe I will finally breathe." No one stopped me this time as I walked toward the door. The snow had thickened outside the driveway, already covered again. Behind me, voices rose in low arguments, Elaine defending Dorothy, insisting Barbara, explaining. For the first time, the narrative was shifting, and it was not in Monica's favor. I stepped into the cold air, the sharp wind biting at my cheeks. The world outside was quiet, steady, untouched by the chaos inside. My boots crunched against the snow as I headed toward my car, each step firm carrying me farther from the house that had never been a safe place for me. Back at my own house, the boxes lined every wall of the living room, stacked high like uneven towers. Some were labeled carefully in black marker, others sealed shut in a hurry, with tape peeling at the edges. The once warm space felt less like a home, and more like a storage unit waiting to be emptied. I sank into the armchair I had not yet wrapped, pulling my phone from my pocket. The screen lit with missed calls. 6 from relatives in Ohio, 3 from cousins in Indiana, 1 from an uncle I had not spoken to in over a decade. The voicemail notifications piled up. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. "Claire, this is Aunt Susan. I just heard from Elaine. I cannot believe you would leave Monica without a place. You have always been so cold." Another voice followed, lower and sterner. "Your father is right. Family is family. You may have money now, but one day you will regret this, Claire." The words blurred together, each one carrying the same accusation, the same rehearsed disappointment. By the 5th message, I stopped listening and let the phone drop into my lap. I rubbed my temples, the weight of their judgment pressing harder than the cardboard boxes surrounding me. The silence of the room deepened. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint whistle of wind against the window panes. I stared at the towers of packed memories and wondered how many of these things had cost me sleepless nights, how many had been bought with overtime hours and meals skipped. After a while, I stood and wandered to the bookshelf, half-emptied dust outlines marking where my favorite novels once sat. A frame had slipped between 2 stacks wedged in the corner. I pulled it free and brushed off the dust. The photograph hit me like a punch. There I was, in 2014, standing on the porch of this very house, a set of keys in my hand, my smile wide enough to split my face. The realtor had snapped it as a surprise after closing, catching the exact moment I realized I had done it. Bought a house completely on my own. I stared at that younger version of myself. My hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, my coat too thin for the February chill, but my eyes shining. Pride without apology. Accomplishment that did not depend on anyone else's approval. I pressed the frame against my chest, sinking onto the edge of a box. The phone buzzed again on the armchair, another cousin calling, but I ignored it. Their voices could not erase this picture, could not rewrite what I had built with my own 2 hands. My mind wandered back to those first nights in the house. No curtains yet, the windows bare, me eating Chinese takeout on the floor because I had not bought furniture. The air had smelled of fresh paint and possibility. I remembered falling asleep surrounded by paint cans, too tired to keep brushing the walls, but too proud to stop smiling. I thought of the sacrifices stacked behind that smile. Years of paying down student loans while watching Monica rack up credit card debt my parents wiped away. Years of driving a rusted Toyota while they helped her lease a new car she could not afford. The furnace breakdowns, the leaks, the endless repairs, all of it built into these walls, all of it mine. I set the frame carefully on top of the nearest box, tracing the edge with my fingers. That photo was my reminder. My proof that every decision I made now was not out of cruelty but survival. I had given enough of myself already. The phone buzzed again, this time with a message notification. I opened it and read the family group chat, the words swimming on the screen. Heartless, cold, a disgrace. Each one punctuated by Monica's own updates, painting herself as a victim of my selfishness. I closed my eyes, letting the sting pass. Their chorus of judgment was familiar. I had been labeled difficult, stubborn, unyielding since I was a child. Only now the label had shifted to cruel. But the pattern was the same. If I refused to give, I was the villain. I stood, stretching my stiff back, and walked to the kitchen. The counters were bare except for a kettle and 2 mugs I had left unpacked. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the whistle soon filling the empty house. The sound was comforting, grounding. As I poured the hot water over a tea bag, I glanced back at the photograph resting on the box. That young woman had believed she could build a life without needing rescue. She had been right. I was still standing even after years of storms and deaths and family disappointment. I was still here with a choice they could not take from me. The tea warmed my hands as I sat back down. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, muting the streetlights, wrapping the neighborhood in white. Inside, the weight of family judgment pressed heavy, but the photo on the box glowed in the lamplight, reminding me of who I was before the noise, before the demands. I took a long sip, letting the heat steady me. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened. I did not owe them more sacrifice. I owed myself peace. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and insistent, echoing through the half-packed rooms. I set my mug on the counter and wiped my hands on a dish towel, already knowing who stood on the other side of the door. When I opened it, Richard and Elaine were there, bundled in heavy coats, their expressions stiff. Monica stood between them, her scarf draped loosely, her eyes wide and damp, as though she had been practicing sorrow in the mirror. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice firm but rehearsed. I stepped aside, letting them into the living room. The boxes stacked against the walls seemed to unsettle them, reminders that my decision was already in motion. Elaine's eyes lingered on the photograph of me holding the keys in 2014 resting on top of a box. She pressed her lips together and turned away. They did not sit until I gestured to the couch. Monica folded herself into the corner, shoulders, hunched, her tissue already in her hand. Richard stayed standing, looming near the window, and Elaine perched on the edge of the cushion like she might spring forward at any moment. "Family helps family." Richard began, his words clipped. "That is how we survive. That is how we have always done it." Elaine nodded quickly, her voice softer, coaxing. "Claire, we know you feel hurt, but you cannot turn your back on your sister. She just needs a little time, a roof over her head while she gets settled." Monica dabbed at her eyes, looking at me with practiced fragility. "Just a few months, Claire. I swear I will get back on my feet. I cannot do this alone." Her voice cracked perfectly on the last word. I sat across from them, folding my hands in my lap, letting the silence stretch long enough for their words to echo back at themselves. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the coffee table toward Monica. "Harper & Company Media has an entry-level marketing position. Interviews are next week. I already spoke to HR. If you want stability, this is a start." Her eyes flickered down to the card, then back up at me. She let out a brittle laugh, shaking her head. "You think a low-level job will solve everything? I am not desperate enough to take scraps." Richard bristled, his voice sharp. "That is insulting, Claire. She needs real help, not this." I leaned back against the chair, my tone even. Real help is giving her the chance to stand on her own. Anything else is just postponing the same problem. Elaine's cheeks flushed pink. "She has always been more fragile than you. She cannot handle what you handle." I met her gaze steady. "Maybe it is time she learns." Monica pushed the card back toward me with the edge of her finger, her lips tight. "I do not want your charity." I did not move to pick it up. The card stayed there, white against the dark wood, the logo catching the lamplight. We sat in tense silence, the only sound the hum of the furnace. Finally, Elaine stood, smoothing her coat. "We have said what we came to say. You will regret this, Claire." Richard gave a curt nod, ushering Monica toward the door. She followed, her shoulders slumped, her eyes cast down. As she passed the coffee table, her hand brushed the card. I caught the flicker of movement, the way her fingers curled, just enough to slip it into her pocket before she straightened again. I pretended not to notice, only walked them to the door and held it open as the cold air rushed in. Richard muttered good night without meeting my eyes. Elaine gave me a look filled with disappointment, as if she could will me into shame. Monica lingered for half a second, her expression unreadable, then stepped out into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, the quiet of the house wrapping around me once more. For a long moment I stood there listening to their car start, watching the headlights cut across the snow before fading down the street. I turned back to the room, my gaze falling on the empty spot on the table where the card had been. A small shift, barely noticeable, but it was there. And though I knew better than to hope, I allowed myself to feel the weight of that moment. Not a resolution, not a victory, but the faintest sign that maybe, just maybe, something had cracked in the pattern. By the first week of January, the townhouse in River North already felt more like home than the house I had left behind. The rent was nearly 40% less than my old mortgage, and the relief of that fact showed up in every part of my life. I slept deeper, I ate, without counting every dollar, and I breathed easier knowing the repairs belonged to someone else now. The place was smaller, yes, but the tall windows poured light into the living room each morning. The hardwood floors gleamed, the hum of the city drifting in through the glass, instead of the quiet resentment of the suburbs. I unpacked slowly, taking my time deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. With each box emptied, I felt lighter, as if I had shed not just things but years of burden. On Tuesday evening, I walked to the community center, a few blocks away, for my first photography class. My camera hung heavy but familiar around my neck. Inside, people of all ages gathered, chatting easily as they adjusted straps and lenses. The instructor, a woman with salt and pepper hair and a warm laugh, began with basics, but I felt something stir in me that I had not felt in years. Curiosity. Creativity. The joy of learning something entirely for myself, with no one demanding I give it away. After class, I strolled back through the crisp winter air, my breath fogging as the Chicago skyline shimmered against the frozen river. For once, my thoughts did not drift back to bills or family drama. They stayed with me with the possibility of new beginnings. Still, the past tugged at the edges of my mind. Monica had been quiet online lately. No dramatic posts, no tearful updates, a silence that felt unnatural after the storm she had stirred. Then one afternoon, Lisa from work approached me in the break room, her voice softer than before. "I ran into your sister downtown last week," she said. "She mentioned she went to an interview at Harper and Company. I thought you should know." I froze with my coffee halfway to my lips. I did not let my face betray the swirl of emotions. "Thank you," I managed, setting the cup down. "She did not say how it went," Lisa added, "but she seemed different." Then she left, leaving me to absorb the news. I sat alone thinking of that moment when Monica slipped the business card into her pocket. She had pretended to reject it to maintain her performance, but perhaps she had taken a step I never thought she would. I did not know if it meant change or just another experiment, but it was hers. For once, it was not my responsibility. Friends of Monica's had begun to drift away. Word traveled fast in our circles. The truth about her unpaid rent, her history of bailouts, had leaked through cousins and coworkers until even her most loyal defenders could not deny the pattern. The sympathy that had flooded her Facebook post in December thinned out, leaving only silence where the cheers once echoed. I heard murmurs through family channels. Elaine had stopped sharing Monica's posts. Richard had grown quiet in group chats. Even Aunt Carol had written privately to me saying, maybe Dorothy had been right. Maybe the enabling had gone too far. Their words did not heal the years of imbalance, but they did lighten the load I carried. One evening, I sat by the window of my new living room, the city lights sparkling below. I poured myself a glass of wine and lifted the old photograph I had placed on the side table, the one of me in 2014, holding the keys to my first house. I studied my younger face, the wide smile, the fearless pride. That girl had carried burdens she never should have. That girl had believed it was her job to hold everything together. I set the photo down and looked around at the new space, uncluttered and bright. I realized I was no longer that girl. I did not have to be the older sister who saved everyone else. I was not bound to Monica's crises or my parents' expectations. My life was mine again. The relief was subtle, but powerful, like the loosening of a rope that had been pulling at my chest for decades. I took a slow breath, watching the headlights weave along the streets below, each one carrying someone else's story. Mine, for the first time, was finally free. A week later, I sat at my parents' dining room table again, but everything about it felt different. The long, polished surface that had hosted countless arguments was bare, except for simple placemats and a plain centerpiece of pine cones left over from Christmas. The food was modest roast chicken with potatoes, green beans lightly salted. No champagne chilling, no china pulled from the cabinet, no performance of perfection. Just a quiet dinner, subdued and careful. Richard poured himself a glass of water instead of wine. Elaine fussed briefly with the napkins, her movements smaller than before. Neither of them looked eager to speak. The weight of all that had happened hung in the room, but not with the explosive energy of weeks earlier. It was heavier, slower, like ashes after a fire. Monica sat across from me. She had trimmed her hair shorter and her makeup was minimal. She looked tired, but there was something less frantic about her now. For the first part of the meal, she kept her eyes on her plate, the scrape of her fork the only sound she made. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice tentative. "I started that job," she said, glancing quickly at Richard and Elaine. "At Harper & Company, it is entry-level, just marketing assistant. I am still on probation." Elaine reached out and touched her hand gently. "That is good, sweetheart." Richard gave a stiff nod, but he did not add the gushing praise he once would have. I set down my fork and studied Monica. She avoided my eyes, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "That is a start," I said evenly. "Work is work, and every step matters." She pressed her lips together, and for a moment I saw the old defiance flare in her gaze. Then it softened, her shoulders sagging as though she was too tired to fight. She muttered almost under her breath, "I did not think they would even call me back." But they did. Elaine smiled faintly, her hand still resting on Monica's. I noticed how different it felt now. There was no triumphant glow, no insistence that Monica was destined for more. Just a quiet acceptance that she had finally at least taken a step forward. The conversation drifted after that. Richard asked me about my townhouse. I told him it was smaller but brighter, more manageable. He nodded without comment. Elaine asked about my photography class, her tone polite, not mocking. I explained that it had given me something new to look forward to. She offered a faint smile, the kind that did not reach her eyes, but it was more than I had expected. Dinner ended without the explosions, without the accusations. The silence was not comfortable, but it was no longer hostile either. It felt like a truce. Later that evening, back in my townhouse, I set my coat on the rack and walked into the living room. The hardwood gleamed under the soft glow of the floor lamp. My boxes were mostly unpacked now. The shelves held the books I had decided to keep, and the photograph from 2014 sat framed on the console table, its proud smile facing outward. I opened a bottle of wine and poured a glass, watching the red swirl against the crystal. I carried it to the window, leaning against the frame, as the lights of River North sparkled below. The hum of the city was steady, a comfort rather than a burden. I thought about Monica sitting at a new desk somewhere downtown, answering phones or sorting files. I pictured her pulling out that card I had handed her weeks earlier, the one she had pretended to reject, and I let myself imagine the moment she decided to use it. I did not know if she would last, if she would change, but it was no longer my responsibility to make sure. That weight had been lifted, and I was not picking it back up again. My parents' silence at dinner lingered in my mind. For years they had rushed to defend Monica, to explain her fragility, to cast me as the unyielding one. This time, they had said little. They were adjusting slowly to a new reality where their excuses no longer worked. It was not the apology I once craved, but it was enough. I swirled the wine in my glass, thinking of all the years I had spent bound by that unspoken duty, the constant demand to sacrifice. It had taken me nearly 4 decades to understand that family loyalty should not mean erasing yourself. Tonight, standing in my own space, I finally felt the truth settle in my bones. I was not heartless. I was free. I lifted the glass slightly, not in a toast to anyone else, but in acknowledgement to myself. To the girl in that old photograph who had once thought survival meant constant sacrifice. To the woman I had become who finally understood that boundaries were not cruelty. They were protection. The night was quiet, the city lights blinking against the river, and I let the calm wash over me. No phone buzzing with accusations, no parents demanding more, no sister weeping at my expense. Just me, my home, and the steady rhythm of my own life moving forward. If you had been in my place, what would you have done? Would you have drawn the line the way I did, or would you have kept giving until there was nothing left? Tell me your thoughts about boundaries, about fairness, about whether family obligation should outweigh self-preservation. Share your stories because I know I am not the only one who has faced this.